My name is Joshua Landis, and I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And today we have the pleasure of speaking to Stephen Kinzer. He needs no introduction because he's written a slew of books. Almost everybody who's interested in the Middle East has read one of them, at least. I teach All the Shah's Men in my class, which is a perennial favorite of my students. And he's written several books on Iran. My students have been reading The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers most recently. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Stephen Kinzer.
Thanks for bringing me here.
Well, it's great. Let me begin right with ISIS, Iraq. You've said that we're not going to win this war against ISIS. Why do you think that this is a war that's unwinnable?
This is not a new war. This is not a group that just appeared the way it might have seemed to us. One day we never heard of them, and the next day they had taken over a large swath of the Middle East. That's not the way history really works. This is just a continuation of past wars, and in particular, it's a continuation of our war in Iraq that we fought starting in 2003. At the peak of that war, we were spending $60 billion a year. We had over 150,000 soldiers in Iraq. And we weren't able to win the war. We finally had to withdraw without victory.
But didn't the surge work? We're told by our military men that the surge worked, that we had defeated al-Qaeda. And the president even took credit for that after killing bin Laden. So wasn't it Maliki's fault that this came back?
It's a myth that the surge turned the corner and won the war in Iraq. We never had the war in Iraq won. We had temporary ability, not only militarily, but by buying off a lot of local sheiks to reduce violence. It's certainly true that Maliki's sectarian policies helped create this situation. But if you want to look back to the beginning of the ISIS problem, you have to look back at least 10 years. It goes back to our invasion of Iraq in the first place. And actually, you can even take it further back. It's a mistake to look at these conflicts in the Middle East as isolated. You have to see them as kind of a long continuum. So many of our interventions in the Middle East are aimed principally at cleaning up the mess we made with our last intervention. And ISIS is trying to do the same thing. I think one of the things that ISIS has mastered is propaganda and the use of social media. With their spectacularly grotesque theatrics, they're attempting to draw the United States back into this war. And there's a particular reason for that. ISIS is using our presence in that region as a recruiting tool. If you are a radicalized Muslim sitting in Nigeria or Bosnia or Malaysia or Uzbekistan, the idea of coming to the Middle East to fight against a Shia militia or to fight against the Kurds doesn't seem that exciting. But if you can come and fight against the United States on Middle Eastern soil and hope to kill an American or even be killed by an American, that is a great recruiting tool.
Well, the most recent video, which showed the decapitation of an American aid worker, had an incredible introduction because it was this sort of operatic depiction of killing Americans, of blowing up Americans with IEDs and various other ways. And so you had, in a sort of excruciating but beautiful revenge film. And anybody who's ever wanted revenge on somebody could see how this would suck in people who hate America and think that America is their oppressor. Why does this work? Why do people dislike America so much?
First of all, I think the theatrics work because they play on our emotions. Emotion is always the enemy of wise statesmanship. If we sit back coolly and try to calculate our strategic interests, we probably would realize that plunging back into the Middle East quicksand with 5,000 men and $5 billion is not going to work. But we're not basing our decisions on statesmanship. We're so angry that we feel we need to go in and teach these people a lesson. And I think that's exactly the purpose of this kind of video. If 10 Americans are killed in the dark and we don't really see what happens, it becomes a third-page news story. And in order to have the maximum propaganda effect and make us crazy to push the buttons that drive Americans to intervene against our own interests, these kinds of videos are spectacularly effective.
So what should America have done? I mean, what could the soldiers in Iraq have done? You say the surge didn't work. We're fighting this enemy. How could we beat this enemy?
Well, I think you phrased the question very well. It's not how the enemy can be beaten. What can we do? The answer is we can't do much. The fact is, Middle Eastern societies finally need a chance to try to resolve their own problems. These countries are facing serious kinds of conflicts, but conflict has produced all kinds of civilizations. War produced the United States. Religion kept Europe in the Dark Ages for 1,000 years. Out of that came the Enlightenment. You cannot reshape these societies from thousands of miles away. We are taking away from the people in the Middle East the chance and the responsibility to shape their own societies. And as long as we are in there, we are inhibiting their ability to create their own futures.
Do you think the Middle East is working its way towards an enlightenment today, or towards a religious accommodation, in the sense sort of like 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia?
I do, yes. I don't think it may happen tomorrow or the next day, but I think it's inevitable that a group like ISIS, for example, if it tries to govern, as it's now trying to do in pieces of Iraq and Syria, ultimately will have one of two things will happen. Either it will moderate, or it will be overthrown. But until it has a chance to govern and people have a chance to see how much they hate it, they will be attractive. As long as they're kept out of power and they can maintain this fantasy, we would have provided you with the great, perfect Islamic state, but we can't because outside powers don't let us, then it makes them seem attractive. Once they have to face the challenge of ruling real people, they either have to accommodate the needs of real people or face overthrow. So it's not wise policy for us to go in and crush them, thereby giving them yet another propaganda victory and allowing them to say, just as we were about to create perfect society, the West came in and crushed us again.
So what you're arguing then is that we can't stop this fundamentalist moment. And if we try to put it back in the bottle, we're going to fail and we're going to get it worse. So you're saying, in a sense, the Iranian experiment, Islamic State, had to happen, and it has to play out. And we could not have toppled it. You're saying we shouldn't have overthrown, we shouldn't have supported Sisi against Morsi. In Algeria in 1990s, we should not have aided the military taking over and overthrowing the elections that brought the Muslim fundamentalists to the fore. So you're saying, in a sense, if I understand you, that the Middle East needs to go through this experiment with fundamentalism, wherever it takes them, and that the West should not try to thwart it.
You've put it very well. I think that is where we should ultimately wind up. You know, we are a very different kind of society from the societies in the Middle East. We've somehow come up with this idea over generations that there's really only one way to run a country and to run a society, and it's the way we do it. And every country in the world will be successful or will fail according to how fully they embrace our model of government. But people have their own cultures, and some of these cultures go back many thousands of years before the United States even existed. It's a folly to believe that we can go over and try to make them more like us and that that's something they would want. Let them be. Let them do what we want to do. You know, in the Arab world, they have a proverb, better 40 years under a tyrant than one day under foreign rule. I think that's a widespread view in the world. Let us face our own problems. Let us get through it. Don't come in and feel that you have the real answer and try to tell us what to do.
But we have tons of allies who are demanding that we get involved. Take Sisi and Morsi in Egypt, for example. Sisi, he had the backing of Saudi Arabia, our closest ally, and Israel, our other closest ally in the Middle East. Our friends in Egypt that we had built up, the military, many of the wealthy elite and middle class who look towards Europe and don't look towards Morsi and the fundamentalists, are terrified of them. There's a division in Egyptian society. How can we let down those allies, those friends, and to be taken over, in a sense, by a fundamentalist government that's deeply anti-American, that criticizes materialism, if you will, and thinks that God should rule? How can America, the symbol of democracy, enlightenment, separation of church and state, not defend those principles in a place like Egypt?
There is a long-standing view in the United States that we are the ones who have to be measuring not only which countries are good and which countries are bad, but which factions inside countries are the ones to support and the ones not to support. But we have our own agendas in those countries. It's foolish to say that all we have is the idealistic principle of wanting to spread freedom. We also have our economic interests, our geostrategic interests, and the people in those countries are very aware of this. So I think we ought to look more carefully at who are our real friends in the Middle East. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. A lot of the money that has come to sponsor Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS, groups like that, is coming out of Saudi Arabia. We still consider them an ally. We have gone into Arab societies like Egypt and picked out groups that are not well-liked among the population and turned them into our allies. This just divides society and further covers and limits the ability of ordinary people to influence their political systems. We wouldn't want a foreign country to come into the United States and say, the Democratic Party is no good. Everybody should support the Republicans, and we're going to do whatever we can to promote the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
But
that's
Stephen,
our business.
Saudi Arabia, an ally since the Second World War, we defeated Hitler. I mean, you can argue that we defeated Hitler at the hinge of fate, El Alamein, Stalingrad, when he was trying to get oil. We kept him from getting oil. We strangled his panzer units, his air force, and we defeated him because we had the oil. If we allowed fundamentalists to take over Egypt and then possibly overthrow the Saudi monarchy, we would no longer control the biggest reserves of oil in the Middle East and the world, the Persian Gulf. Having our hand on the oil tap to the Persian Gulf allows us, in a sense, to keep China in check. China can't go off and take this neighboring seas and islands because they know that America has their hand on that oil tap. How does America remain a superpower and relinquish these incredibly important strategic allies like Saudi Arabia?
Well, I don't think we have to turn our back on all of our former allies in the Middle East, but I'd answer that in two ways. First of all, the world oil situation is changing quite dramatically. We have great new reserves in North America, and actually, in one way, I kind of hope that that some of that spigot from the Middle East would be choked off, because it would be just what we need, perhaps, to start focusing on how we can produce energy in the United States and not have to bow down to Middle Eastern sheiks just because we need their oil. And I would add one other point. Our alliance with the elite that controls oil in these countries is part of the reason why the ordinary people in these countries are anti-American. They see that the wealth that we are pouring into those countries in exchange for oil not only doesn't go to improve societies, but it goes to increase the distortions in those societies. That money is not flowing down to ordinary people. Those ordinary people are totally aware that the oil connection between their leaders and the United States is harming their own societies. If other powers take control of those oil reserves, they're still going to need to sell it to the outside world. They can't just hold it for themselves. Oil is a fungible product. It goes into the world market and then it can go from there to anywhere. But actually, maybe losing our unrestricted access to Middle East oil would be what we need to start focusing on alternative sources of energy here.
Well, let me bring you back to Iran here. Today, as this interview takes place, we're in the last minutes of very difficult negotiations with Iran. But you've written 2 books on Iran, and you've always had your eye on Iran for a long time. How do you think we can reset our relations with Iran when it's quite clear that the mullahs use anti-Americanism to retain themselves in power? They deeply believe that our Sunni allies in the Middle East are their enemies and are trying to overthrow them and see them as heretics. How can we get close to Iran? It's anti-Semitism that seems to be embedded in the top clerics, the anti-Israeli. Israel's our closest ally in the Middle East. How do we set that aside and somehow reset our relations with Iran?
Iran and the United States are 2 countries that have inflicted great harm on each other. The Iranians have a good reason to be resentful of the United States, and Americans have good reason to be resentful of Iran. We have a very difficult history, but we shouldn't be imprisoned forever by that history. It's been 35 years that we have been at odds with Iran. If we look calmly at the geostrategic situation in that part of the world, we'll realize that actually our long-term strategic goals are much more in line with Iran's than they are in line with the goals of countries like Saudi Arabia. For example, Iran considers to be the #1 strategic and existential threat to its existence to be radical Sunni militant groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We claim that those groups are our enemies, and I believe they truly are. But many of our so-called friends in the Middle East are actually feeding those groups with money and other kinds of support. If we really want to stabilize the Middle East and crush those kinds of radical groups, we need a partner in that part of the world.
But Kissinger said, when we started this war on ISIS, Kissinger said, do not forget, keep your eye on the prize. Iran is our major enemy. Do not, he was warning the president, do not go off and make ISIS your main enemy and side with Iran against ISIS. He said that would be a terrible mistake because Iran's our true enemy. They're trying to spread their power in the Shiite crescent leading from Hezbollah through Syria to Iraq to Iran. They're going to squeeze our allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia. You've got to leave the party with the people you came with, and that's Israel and Saudi Arabia. Don't get these crazy ideas of somehow, you know, falling in love with Iran.
Well, I think Kissinger was 100% wrong. He's telling us quite explicitly that Iran is a bigger enemy than ISIS. I don't believe this. ISIS is a symbol of instability and upheaval, whereas Iran is the only stable country in that part of the world. One thing Iranians have learned from the bad results of their 1979 revolution is revolution and radical change does not work. And they see what's happened in Egypt and other countries in recent years, and that has even strengthened their view. The Iranian people are the most pro-American, I think, of any population in the world. It's quite startling to see this when you get there. They are on a path towards some kind of broader democracy. I wouldn't dare to say that about Saudi Arabia and some of our other allies in the Middle East. Over the long run, the Iranians have a great ability to help stabilize Iraq and to help stabilize Afghanistan. Stabilizing those countries is a very important strategic goal for us. Now, would they do that in ways that would be calculated to increase their own influence in the region? Of course. That's the reason all powers act, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere. But I think we should recalculate and realize that increasing Iranian influence in some Shia parts of the Middle East is not necessarily bad for us. Stability should be our principal goal in that part of the world. With stability, all things become possible. With upheaval and oppression, like the kind that ISIS is spreading, none of that is possible.
Stephen Kinzer, thank you so much for coming in and talking with us today. It was great.
I look forward to next time.
Okay.